and we know who you are and your email addresses, so we will provide you with the link to the archive so that you can use it later on. And here I see Charlie in Tennessee is on the call. So thank you, everybody, for coming out. Okay, so next slide. So introductions. This is a aerial photograph of our farm. This was probably taken 10 years ago. And this is all the fields that you see are Wood Prairie Farm fields. The pond that you see kind of in the center, our house and our buildings are, if you look to the left of that, you see a white roof. It's actually a galvanized roof, but that's where our buildings are, isolated from the road. The road that you see beside those green fields, kind of bisecting the picture in half, that's called Kinney Road. And the fields on this side of Kinney Road, the bottom portion of the picture, that's in the township of Bridgewater. And then that road's the dividing line between Township D, Range 2, unorganized territory. So that township is 6 miles by 6 miles, and Kinney Road represents the eastern town line. So we are legally residents of TDR2, unorganized territory. So if you look in the distance, that is number 9 mountain, right under the word westward, under the letters ARD. That's number 9 mountain, and that is 6 miles away. So this photograph, while the scale is a bit funny, but that does represent 6 miles. So you can see how tremendously isolated our farm is. There's only a few residents in the entire township, 23,000 acre township, and it tends to be right on this eastern edge, abutting on Bridgewater. So that actually made it easy for us to decide to get into growing seed, because isolation is a seed farmer's best friend. So the isolation prevents cross-pollination from other crops that would jeopardize the purity of our seed. And now in the last 20 years, since transgenic contamination from genetically engineered crops has become a major problem in all seed producing areas, this allows us to get freedom from contamination. And one of the seed crops we grow, in addition to certified seed potatoes, is seed corn. And the pollen, as many of you know, the pollen of corn is relatively mobile, and there's a lot of genetically engineered corn grown in the United States and Canada, so it represents a threat. But fortunately, this isolation that we have has been sufficient to keep us clean. And even though we test at-risk seed lots, we've never had a hot test on seed that we've grown on Wood Prairie Farm. This is a picture of the Garrettson family. I'm the fellow in the middle with the vest and the red shirt. Caleb, Megan, Jim, Amy, Sarah, and Caleb. So we're the ones behind Wood Prairie Farm. Everybody on the farm, everybody in the family works on the farm. Everybody has their own jobs, and we live and work here, and I can tell you this, it's a great way of life. As I said earlier, if anyone has a question, feel free at any time to type it in. Let us know. We'll try to answer it as we go. We will have a Q&A session towards the end of this hour. And we're happy to pick up any topic that you're interested in hearing. Okay, let's get on with it. So what I wanted to talk about first is green sprouting. This slide here is, it's an older photograph, but it basically lays out how we handle our seed prior to planting in the spring. We green sprout virtually all of the seed that we plant, which is about 25,000 pounds of seed per year. And we place the seed in green sprouting containers. And each container holds about 33 pounds of seed, so we use 3 trays per hundredweight. And to make it efficient, we palletize the seed so that we can move it around, move it outside, move it onto a truck to bring it out to the field where we load it into our planter. So this is really the second step in green sprouting. And what I described in the promotional emailing that we sent last night, encouraging folks to sign up for the class here, was there are two steps within the process of green sprouting that a lot of people tend to get wrong, and they're important. So I wanted to mention that. And both have this in common: it's temperature. So there are two stages of green sprouting. And if you don't know what green sprouting is, let me describe that. In Europe, they use the term chitting, C-H-I-T-T-I-N-G-S. Here in the United States, green sprouting is more commonly used, but what it is an optional preconditioning step that a gardener or a farmer can take in growing a crop. What it involves is beginning 4 weeks before your intended planting date, and you warm the seed up, get it to break dormancy, and then once it's broken dormancy, then you transfer the sprouted seed into green sprouting trays such as these wooden ones that we built ourselves, and then lower the temperature and allow them to mature in the green sprouting trays so that when you plant them in the field, they are primed and ready to grow fast for quick emergence and get off to a fast start. The primary benefit of doing green sprouting is that it will knock 10 to 14 days off the growth cycle in the field. And while that may not seem like a lot, I can tell you this after having done this for 25 years, you get into a situation in August to where you either have drought conditions, excessive rain conditions, excessive pressure from Colorado potato beetle or leafhoppers, or weeds that are maybe getting out of control because you had rainy conditions in the spring when you were trying to do your cultivation and hilling, and the rain prevented you from the timeliness of those operations. 2 weeks in August is worth a whole lot more than the month and fair amount of effort that it takes in the springtime. So this is a very intensive technique, and the type of agriculture that we have in North America and the U.S. and Canada is extensive, where the idea is to produce on a lot of acres, and it contrasts with how it's done in Europe. In Europe, land is at a premium, so their production is done more intensively, in which every acre counts. So in order to get the highest possible yield, this is a much more common practice in Europe, where there's a different style of agriculture. They have intensive agriculture, we have extensive agriculture, but I would submit that the organic farms in North America are much more like the intensive farms of Europe. So then a practice like green sprouting, I believe, is well suited to an organic production system. If you look at it, typical, say a mid-season variety that's in the field for 80 days, you're talking about something like 11 weeks. Just imagine if you can cut 2 weeks off that growth cycle, that's a benefit. If you're a market farmer and you're selling at the farmer's market, imagine the advantage that you would have by coming to market 10 to 14 days ahead of your competition and having potatoes to sell there. And back in the 1980s, when we sold at the farmers markets, we came to realize that whoever had that earliest crop, that tended to seal the deal. So you would get loyalty to customers that would come to you, say you had the first peas or the first squash or the first potatoes, and then that would be a captured customer that would come back to you week after week after week. So I think for a market gardener, having that early crop is very valuable. So that's another reason for it. But from our standpoint, it does give us another benefit, and that's we're very far in northern Maine. Our growing season is limited, and there are some late season varieties that we would have trouble growing if we did not do this green sprout. That allows us to get a good crop and reasonable yield out of it, and be able to ship those seed potatoes further south where you've got a much longer growing season and you don't have that same restraint. So it allows us to come up with varieties that otherwise might be a challenge to grow in Maine. So anyway, green sprouting we are sold on. We think that it's a good technique for all growers. It is optional. It's not anything that you have to do, but if you can do it, I believe that you'll find that it's worth the effort. So those two tricks, the temperature is very important. So first off, you want to warm this seed up for about a week, 7 to 10 days, depending on the variety. Some varieties are less dormant than others. Others are more dormant. The more dormant varieties, two examples that come to mind are Swedish Peanut and Red Cloud. They are very dormant varieties. They are difficult to wake up in the spring. Those are ones that would really benefit from green sprouting. So as Scott has chatted with us and is asking how warm, what you want to do is have 65 to 70 degrees up to 65 or 70 degrees up to 75 degrees for that 1 week of dormancy breaking period. And here's why it's important. When you sprout potatoes at a higher temperature, you are suppressing apical dominance. The apical end of a seed potato is the end opposite the stem, and it tends to have a concentration of eyes, but there's a primary eye, the apical, well, what we call a king sprout, that will tend to go, and when the king sprout is left to its own, it will sprout and it will dominate over the secondary sprouts. By sprouting 70 to 75 degrees, you are suppressing the dominance of that king sprout, and that is helping to facilitate the secondary sprouts. And this all traces back to setting the stage for the highest possible yield. The highest yield that you can get on potatoes comes from having the highest set, or number of tubers per hill. So if you have, and that would be measured by, say, per 100 row feet or per acre. So the highest amount of set, the highest number of tubers, that positions you towards getting the highest possible yield at the end of the year. And the reason is this: if you have a king sprout, say sprouting your potatoes at 42 degrees, you'll tend to get one dominant sprout. That potato, like all living beings, it is programmed to reproduce itself. And it'll set one tuber, maybe two tubers. And then those two tubers, if that's all that that plant sets, those tubers are going to go oversize. If you're a farmer that is growing crops to sell, it will become too large to meet market demand, and you won't have any other potatoes beyond those two. That potato sprouting at cold temperature, maintaining its apical dominance, that is meeting its biological demand of reproducing itself. All that potato needs is one tuber to reproduce itself into the next generation. And we have seen potatoes in our rotation come up, a tuber left behind 1 year that will find itself in the next year when we plant grain in our rotation. The potato may grow in there and we might not notice it. We've actually seen potatoes a couple of years into the soil. The year after grain, we have clover growing, and we've found potatoes growing in that are basically maintaining their genetic strain right in that one place in the field. Well, as gardeners and as farmers, we're all for potatoes expressing their biological demand, but we want to help them do it for our benefit. It means to get as many potatoes as we can to size up. So the secondary sprouts, that's where they come into play. The number of tubers that are going to set in a hill is a direct linear connection to the number of stems, and each of those eyes that's going to sprout, that's going to become a sprout, which is going to become a stem. So the technique of managing at a higher temperature in green sprouting is a methodology for increasing the sprouting, which will increase the stems, which will increase the set, which will lay the foundation for the highest possible yield, so that if everything else is going right, meaning you've got good fertility, you've got plenty of rain, then you can gain the highest possible yield. But it all begins with getting a good set. And there are other factors involved in getting a good set. When tuber set is occurring, which occurs approximately 4 weeks after emergence, if you get plenty of moisture, rain at that time, or irrigation for those folks in the West that don't get rain in the growing season, having adequate moisture will help that plant set a high number of tubers. Basically, the moisture triggers the process in the potato that thinks, hey, this is going to be a lush year. We might as well set a lot of tubers because we can support them this year because the conditions are there. So getting moisture to the tuber at tuber set is very important to get that high set. This is a second technique, and it's a little bit more manageable. Many of us are very busy during tuber set, and it becomes problematic getting water onto a field if you're still doing the hilling process. So this is one way to encourage getting a higher set should it turn dry during the tuber set time. And in Maine, I'd say we get dry tuber set maybe 2 out of 10 years. So it typically is not a problem, but I can tell you from having experienced this, when you do have dry weather during tuber set, even if you're green sprouting, that can hurt. And if you have any ability to get moisture on during that window, it's about a 10-day window of the primary tuber initiation, it is a really good time to make sure that that soil is moist. Okay, so back to green sprouting. So your initial green sprouting, stage 1, is a period lasting 7 to 10 days, depending on dormancy. And you want that sprouting to go on at 70 degrees, even 75 degrees. Once you see the beginnings of a sprout coming in the eye, even the tiniest sprout, that is indication that the tuber has broken dormancy. And it's at that point that you can then shift to stage 2. And this is where the temperature factor comes in again. So at stage 2, once the potatoes have broken dormancy and are actively growing, that's when you want to put them, expose them to light. And if you've got a smatter seed, if you've got, say, our experimental package, and you've got a dozen tubers of 4 different varieties, 3 tubers each, you could get an old egg carton that held a dozen eggs, and you could stick your dozen tubers into that egg carton and expose it. So it's really a scale thing. In our scale, handling 25,000 pounds, that's a lot of weight, so you want to be efficient at it. So this is our technique of getting it into green sprouting trays, but the principle beyond is the same. And here it is with the temperature. You want to drop that temperature down from the 65 to 70 degree dormancy breaking temperature. You want to drop it down to 50 degrees. The reason you do this is you're trying to manage respiration at a rate which will maintain the greatest amount of energy in that seed tuber and not waste that energy with high respiration, with moisture loss, and basically with loss of energy that is better kept in that tuber until it's planted in the soil. And the risk is that if the respiration is too high, i.e. if the temperature is too high, and it's a linear relationship, the higher the temperature, the higher the respiration, you're going to lose some of that energy, and that energy is directly connected to the potential for yield. So you want to maintain that seed in good condition, and the way to do that is to lower that temperature to 50 degrees. Many of our customers over the years, we've had a lot of people kind of get maybe the 70 degree for stage 1, and then they stick the tubers in a high tunnel or a greenhouse, thinking that this is really perfect conditions for providing light. And while the light is beneficial in the greenhouse. It's way too hot, and you're going to get high respiration, so much so that you're going to get moisture loss on those tubers, and to the extent that you can actually see the tubers shriveling. So that is an indication that you've lost energy, and the way to avoid that is keeping the temperature down, and you're just not going to keep it cool enough in a greenhouse that's at 50 degrees. And this would go for a full green sprouting procedure. I do know that there's benefit simply from warming up seed. There was an informal experiment done here in Maine 25 years ago, where the state seed farm, they were planting one variety, and it was a Friday, and they planted, say, half of the seed lot. And then they didn't work on the weekend, came back on Monday to plant. And knowing this, the manager took a truckload of cut seed, put it into the garage, and he turned up the heat to 70 or 75 degrees. They took that truckload of cut seed out Monday, planted it 2-3 days later after that first half had been planted. What they found was the seed planted 3 days later that had been warmed over the weekend at 75 degrees yielded 15% higher with no other variations. That was the only difference, was having been warmed up. So we do recommend that you always warm seed, even if you don't have time or the labor to manage doing a full green sprouting. We highly recommend that you take the seed from us and bring it up to 70 or 75 degrees for at least a couple of days, and you will find that it pays in terms of a better yield. And if you're skeptical of this, then take some of that seed you get from us, keep it cool, warm some of the others for 2 or 3 days, and plant them with everything else as equal to the same type of soil, same type of fertility, same type of moisture. And then, write it down in a notebook so that by the end of the season you can remember what side of the garden or the field was done which way. But and then if you, I think that you'll find by your own experience that it's a beneficial way to go. And if anyone does that, I would be interested in getting your firsthand experience from it, and we can share that with other people. So in summary, with green sprouting, what you want to do is start out the first week at 70 to 75 degrees and in the dark, and then switch over to lighted conditions, and that light can either be natural daylight, it can be incandescent, it can be fluorescent. It doesn't matter which, it just has to be sufficiently strong. If you find that the sprouts are elongating, it means that you don't have sufficient light and you need to increase the number of lumens to give that potato the light that it needs. A potato is going to search for light, and it'll be take a long sprout to do that, but in sufficient light, the sprouted potato will be very tight and concise. It'll green up in the present. The tuber will green up, the sprout will green up, and the sprout will be a concentrated growth, maybe 3/4 of an inch wide, 3/4 of an inch high, but it will not elongate. If you find, even when you have sufficient light, that you're getting elongation of that sprout, it means that the seed is so vigorous that you're going to have to reduce its respiration some way. So drop that temperature down from 50 degrees. There could be, in some circumstances, a need to drop it down to 45 degrees, down to 4 degrees, but that usually is not the case. Usually the lengthening of the sprout is because of the light being insufficient. Okay, here Beverly is asking how many hours per day. Well, I believe that it's sufficient to have on for 10 or 12 hours, have the light on for 10 or 12 hours a day. My attitude is this: I'm a little bit of a creature of the culture that I live in. So in Aroostook County, 60 years ago, Aroostook County was the primary potato producing area in Maine, and at that time Maine was the #1 potato producing state in the United States. there is a strong potato culture up here, and one of the aspects of that culture is this idea that if a little bit is good, then a lot's got to be better. And it is hard to not draw yourself into that. So my attitude is we keep the lights on 24 hours a day. We've got efficient fluorescent lights, and my concern is maintaining as much vigor in that seed as we can. So we're very careful about monitoring the temperature, and we're wanting to err on the side of too much light. And when you've got as much potatoes as we've got, you know, you can see in that photograph, you can see the darkness in there. You cram those pallets too close together, it's a challenge to get enough light in. So our way of doing it is we keep the lights on 24 hours a day, but the textbooks say that 10 or 12 hours of light does it. Now, in Holland, where they green sprout, their springs are much more mild than what we experience here in Maine. They'll pelletize the green sprouted potatoes, and they'll set them out on asphalt in the front yard and put a rain bonnet on them and leave them out there 24 hours a day. So they get, 12 hours worth of light from the sunshine during the day. And then at night, they don't bring them in. Now, in Maine, we could never get away with that. We typically begin our green sprouting in mid-April, and then with intention of planting beginning mid-May. And most nights are still in the low 20s, mid 20s at that time of the year. So we definitely would need to bring them back inside. We've got one old farmer friend that used to put his potatoes on the back of a truck, and during the day he'd drive the truck out of the garage, let it catch sunlight, and then when it turned dark at night, he'd back the truck into the garage and close the doors. So that's another technique for being efficient. So how many days in the second stage? A question from Carmen. That's simply the remainder of what you started with. So you're starting your green sprouting 4 weeks before your intended planting date. You've got 7 days, maybe 10 days of high temperature dormancy breaking conditions, and then you lower it to the 50 degrees for the balance of that 4 weeks. So it's going to be something like 3 weeks, maybe 2.5 weeks if you've got a very dormant variety like a red cloud that takes forever to wake up in the spring. Now, I don't want you to think that I don't have respect for red cloud. Red cloud is a great variety, and dormancy in the spring is the resistance to sprouting. Well, that in the spring may be a hassle, but it's a real advantage when you're storing potatoes in the fall and in the winter. That resistance to sprouting maintains high condition of marketability for those potatoes. So a very dormant variety is going to be one that a farmer would want to ship out of storage in the late winter and spring because it is so resistant to sprouting. So these are just individual characteristics. Every variety has its own characteristics, and you work with that. So with red cloud, we always put them and the Swedish peanut nearest the heat source, knowing that they're going to benefit because they're so stubborn to break out of dormancy. So if anyone has any questions about green sprouting, type them in, and we'll go over them, and otherwise we'll go ahead and go on to the next topic. So Butte. One of the favorite varieties that we grow is Butte, and it's quite an interesting variety with an interesting history about it. I was fortunate enough to meet the breeder of Butte many years after we'd started growing it. About 20 years ago, the Potato Association of America had its summer meeting in Bangor, Maine, and I needed to go to Bangor to pick up parts for our bulldozer from the dealership down there, and I was able to coordinate it, so I made a single trip and picked up parts and went to the PAA meeting and met Joe Pavick, Dr. Joe Pavick, who I don't recall if he was retired at that time. I think either he was retired, he retired within a couple of years. So that was in '95, and this variety Butte was bred by Joe Pavick at University of Idaho in 1965. So that would be, what, 50 years ago this year. Typical of any new variety, it takes about 12 years of development before a new variety is released. So it was released in 1977. Immediately, one of the outstanding qualities of Butte came to be known. It had been tested against russet Burbank, which has been the standard russet potato for, well, at its time, I think russet was a russeted variation of the Burbank that Luther Burbank bred in around 1878 or something like that. So this one is probably a variety from around the 1880s, and it is still the most widely grown variety in the United States, largely because russet Burbank is made into French fries, and that's the big demand for potatoes nowadays. It also has been a strong, what we call a table stock variety. In England, they would call them ware potatoes. Here in the States, farmers call them table stock. But table stock or potatoes